Okay, I think it's ticked over to 1:30, so welcome everyone. I'm James Whitley, Senior Research Manager at Ecoris. I'll show the agenda shortly, but firstly just to note that this session is being recorded. I'd like to pass over to Piera from ESPON to give an introduction to the session.
Thank you, James, and welcome everyone. Greetings from Luxembourg. This event is part of the ESPON Week on Aging and takes inspiration from the World Health Organization Decade of Healthy Aging. This is the fourth session this week, and we have 3 more to come until Friday. A group of cities led by Greater Manchester asked for ESPON support to investigate the effectiveness of policies and initiatives to develop age-friendly cities. We have responded to the city's needs with the project ESPON ACPA that includes a report, a policy handbook, case studies, maps and figures. All these deliveries are available at our website in English and in the stakeholder national languages. We are also drafting a policy brief on aging that will include the outcomes of this conference. At the opening session of the week last Monday, all parties involved agreed that it is time to join forces in this decade of healthy aging. And it's time to work together to achieve a more age-friendly territories in Europe. Our proposal to strive for a silver deal, just like the Green Deal, was well received by all participants. And the Vice President of the European Commission, Madame Suica, highlighted at the opening session that where we live also impacts how we age, and that therefore it's vital that cities can be a shining example of intergenerational solidarity, caring and inclusiveness. She also added that it's important that we balance our policy making for older people. And finally, she called to seize the moment together to find the best policy solutions to make our cities a wonderful place to live. I would like to thank all participants, speakers, our partners, namely Ecoris and Nordregio, and the stakeholders that have asked for ESPON support. In the case of the UK, a special thank goes to Paul McGarry and his colleagues. It has been really a huge pleasure to work with you. That's all for my side. Thank you and enjoy this session. Back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Piera. Next slide, please. So an overview of today, I'll talk about the findings from the ACPA study overall, then go on to Greater Manchester and its demographics, success factors, challenges and opportunities, and some recommendations. Second session is with Nicola from the Centre for Aging Better. We'll talk about their partnership with the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Then we have Ange, also from the Centre, who will talk about the UK network of age-friendly cities, which Greater Manchester is a part of. And then finally, there'll be a Q&A with the 3 of us and Paul McGarry from Greater Manchester Aging Hub. If you'd like to ask any questions, we've got quite a few people in this session, so can I ask that you put any questions you'd like to be answered in the chat function, and make sure that you send them to everyone so we can see that that's not the default setting. So remember to send it to everyone, any questions. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I work for Ecoris. We're a research organisation of 91 years standing. ESPON, the acronym does what it says on the tin really in terms of the name. So it's a European grouping dedicated to building knowledge on spatial planning, also known as urban planning. The ACPA study, the premise is that there's a demographic transition to an ageing population, particularly in rural areas, and that's now starting to appear in urban areas. So what can we learn from that? And you can see the research questions for the study on the right of screen there. There were a number of cities involved in the study, all acting to improve quality of life for older people. So they are Amsterdam, Barcelona, Gothenburg, Hengelo, Nantes, Oslo, Zaragoza and Greater Manchester, which is obviously the focus of today's presentation. And the case study involved consultation with a range of relevant stakeholders and analysis of spatial data. Next slide, please. So in terms of the findings from the study overall, firstly, it confirmed the demographic trends that are widely known, and they extend to urban areas as well. Also, older people were positive about growing old in cities, so they are closer to shops, social opportunities, jobs and connectivity. There are also concerns about self-reliance. Cities are often seen as a young person's space, concerns about digitalisation, infrastructure, insecurity in public spaces and on transport, that is, housing that needs to be affordable, adaptable and lead to social interactions, and also concerns of a lack of activities and services for minority groups. Good practice highlighted in the studies. There's a need to understand problems through past and future trends. Also, services and policies must work together and find solutions together, rather than ageing being isolated in its own separate agenda, or simply just focusing on problems and solutions that simply just involve older people. So things like accessibility can be an issue for new families. Think about prams and buggies, pregnant women, people with disabilities, not just older people. Transport, for example, everyone wants good transport, so these wider solutions are appreciated. There should be meaningful consultation and representation of older people. Also helpful to get support and funding from key political figures in developing political consensus. So there's long-term stability instead of occasional pilot projects. I'm happy to report that all of those good practice factors were evident in Greater Manchester. In terms of policy recommendations, so more cities should join the Age-Friendly Cities Network and exchange experiences regularly, including within countries, so between cities and within cities, and through other European bodies such as Age Europe, URBACT, and the European Innovation Partnership on Active and Healthy Aging. It should be a long-term flexible strategy to 2030 and beyond. As many stakeholders as possible should contribute to this, and a common narrative should be developed together. Also need to monitor impact and progress about what works and what doesn't. Next slide, please. So turning to the Greater Manchester case study, Greater Manchester City in the northwest of England in the UK. Key thing to know is it's not actually a city. Manchester and Salford within Greater Manchester are the cities. Greater Manchester is a city region and a combined authority of 10 metropolitan boroughs that you can see on the right of screen there. The population is almost 3 million people, which is the second most in the UK and the most outside of Greater London. And population is the 16th most in Europe. It was the 13th most in the EU. It spans 1,300 kilometres square, which is the second largest area in the UK. Next slide, please. So in terms of demographics, similar to other urban areas, really. So on the left, you can see the concentration of older people. So it's highest amongst outer, less urban areas, such as Bramhall and Marple, that are highlighted on the screen there. It's lowest within city centres, Manchester and Salford, again highlighted. On the right of screen, you can see a similar pattern to the concentration of older people. This is the change in older populations. So over time, that has been towards outer, less urban areas. But I think it's important to remember, I say less urban areas, not rural or non-urban, really, because these are still within a city region, these areas. Next slide, please. So the combined authority set up the Greater Manchester Aging Hub to coordinate age-friendly agenda across Greater Manchester. The tagline or theme is doing ageing differently. So the difference that's being referred to there relates to a number of different things. So firstly, the power has been devolved from central government to the Greater Manchester City region, led by the Mayor of Greater Manchester from 2015 onwards. And that importantly includes devolution of the health and social care budget. Difference also means a different approach needed, given that there's increasing life expectancy, as we've discussed, and the need to act now regarding policies and planning frameworks which will influence lives of older people over the next few decades. So I've got to act now to influence those, really. Doing things differently is a tagline across other Greater Manchester strategies and for the combined authority more generally. Now, this comes from a quote which is attributed to Tony Wilson, who's a famous music promoter and journalist. I do stress that the quote was attributed to him, not necessarily made by him, because Greater Manchester in the 80s is one of those places where they say, if you remember it, then you weren't really there. But I can certainly say, as someone who comes from Yorkshire, across the Pennines, and often seen as Greater Manchester's rivals, if you like, there really is a strong shared identity across Greater Manchester, perhaps dating back hundreds of years. And what this shared identity that's really strong translates to is that there's co-working across the 10 local authorities in the region. And practically all consultees that we spoke with reflected a history of cooperation, shared resources and thinking. Next slide, please. So the first elected mayor of Greater Manchester is Andy Burnham, who was elected in 2017. The mayor's been very influential, and the level of his influence is so great that he's one of very few people that lends himself to an internet meme, which is a theme that's shared across the internet and replicated on social media. So think about Donald Trump and how many things are shared about him. So similar for the mayor of Greater Manchester. So the story behind the meme is that Greater Manchester and the mayor were negotiating with government officials for a financial support package to compensate for regional COVID lockdown restrictions. Negotiations weren't going well, and mid-negotiations, Burnham held an impromptu press conference. So in the first picture you can see here, he was shown a news story on a mobile phone saying that the government were imposing restrictions anyway, with their original offer of support that was only £22 million, which works out about £7 or €8 per person across Greater Manchester. The picture on the right that you can see shows Burnham exhaling while he's visibly frustrated. So the meme became the picture on the left, followed by something disappointing. So the central picture for Burnham might be the Prime Minister, who imposed restrictions anyway. And then you've got the picture on the right that indicates disappointment. So this perhaps slightly convoluted example shows that the mayor of Greater Manchester has a level of influence that's almost unparalleled, really. So it's been incredibly important that he's been able to champion this agenda, champion healthy ageing, promoting this agenda as one of his election manifesto promises, featuring it as one of the combined authorities' 10 priorities as part of the Greater Manchester strategy, which is supported by the wider authority and its 10 local authorities. So also important has been the roles of the age-friendly Greater Manchester portfolio lead and chief executive. These signal to the region that this agenda is important, with significant implications in terms of policy profile and support. So in addition to the combined authority, each of the 10 local authorities have made commitments regarding ageing via their local plans as well. Just a brief update on the story behind the meme. So Greater Manchester were offered £22 million. They wanted 65 million, which was down from their original ask of 90 million. After an outcry, the government said you get 60 million or nothing. But then 8 days later imposed national lockdown restrictions anyway. So all this in the end related to just a few days of support, and there was much political capital on both sides gained and lost. Next slide, please. In terms of other strategic success factors, involving older people in decision making, and that's at various levels, not just high level, but getting views of grassroots and minorities as well. Forums for that range from the strategic to the voluntary sector via old people's forums and networks, and you can see the Greater Manchester Older People's Network on the right of screen here. Concept of ageing is often seen as a deficit based model or negatively, often associated with the medical model of ageing. For example, use of terms like frail older people and bed blockers. Framing ageing within strengths-based, i.e. positive approaches and language such as age-friendly and all age has been welcomed by older people in particular who don't want to be discussed in such negative contexts or seen as a burden. And in addition, age-friendly has provided a strong brand and connections to other cities in UK, Europe and worldwide that are utilising similar approaches. Next slide, please. But I'd be misrepresenting things if it was all down to Greater Manchester's history and the role of the mayor and these strategic success factors. At a delivery level, there's lots of work going on by a range of organisations, some dating back many years. It's been hard to capture as evaluators because age-friendly is a cross-cutting theme, so it's not like there's some projects that are age-friendly and some projects that aren't. It's a cross-cutting theme across many different projects that, age-friendly touches everything, really. The Ageing Hub coordinates this agenda across Greater Manchester across those 6 themes, and consultees identified transport and health as key themes, notwithstanding the disadvantages of the medical model of ageing that I talked about in the last slide. The Hub and the Combined Authority more generally have been able to use existing infrastructure, whether that's physical in terms of transport buildings, organisational, i.e. existing organisations working in this space, or geographical, so cross-authority relationships. And this infrastructure has been supplemented by other investment. So the National Lottery have funded the Ambition for Ageing programme, and that includes Working Potential, which is focuses on older people's employment, which is often seen as a neglected issue. There's also expertise from local universities, which are joined together as MICRA, so the Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research on Ageing. There's anchor institutions such as museums and art galleries, and there's funding in a strategic partnership with the charity, the Centre for Ageing Better, which you'll hear more about later. Also on a micro level, age-friendly training is available across the region. Next slide, please. In terms of challenges and opportunities identified from the research, in terms of challenges, obviously resourcing and inequalities are challenges in delivering services and outcomes for older people generally. The ability of local government and the voluntary sector to deal with these can vary. Consultees felt that these wider issues, including health and poverty, need to be addressed first before issues associated with ageing can effectively be tackled, particularly amongst those lower income groups across the city. Age-friendly and its link to urban ageing is still a relatively new concept, and many of the outcomes desired from this initiative will take many years to realise. Particularly with many older people living in the less urban areas, transport infrastructure can be variable, including things like infrequent bus services, lack of services at weekends, and poor connections between transport modes. Cost of transport can often be expensive, which again disproportionately affects those on lower incomes. Physical infrastructure in the urban environment is not necessarily age-friendly, so housing, planning, street furniture, such as lack of benches to sit on, commercial and retail offerings can sometimes struggle to appeal to older people. There's also variation amongst older people as a group. They can't be defined by age group necessarily. Some older people are in better health with better life opportunities than other people of the same age and can have drastically different experiences. In terms of opportunities, there's an increasing narrative in the UK about social prescribing, and awareness is improving, but it's still a relatively new concept with a relatively weak evidence base at the moment. Also relies on communities having assets and a developed voluntary sector, which not all areas have. Consultees felt that there was a number of benefits of growing old in the city. So the tram system is generally viewed positively, felt to be accessible, and is going to expand over the coming years. There's also lots of cultural activities, museums and places of interest in the city. And accessing services is easier in the city as they're hubs of facilities. Also, the private sector, shops, supermarkets, smaller companies could support and potentially fund opportunities for older people. So in the case study, we saw shops and supermarkets supporting older people with dementia by signing up to the Dementia Friendly Charter. Next slide, please. In terms of recommendations, so age-friendly can feel like a fledgling agenda with outcomes in the longer term. It's useful to emphasise intermediate goals to drive short-term progress. As I said before, Greater Manchester has engaged well with the local academic community. Useful for other areas to do this as well, which might help to drive innovation. Also, to other areas, do try new approaches. Don't be afraid of ideas not working. They can provide valuable learning experiences for future development. Thematic recommendations. So stakeholders and older people express frustration with deficit-based models and language used in relation to ageing. Age-friendly and all age was seen, as we discussed, as more acceptable, with ageing framed as part of their longer life cycle rather than a separate development. So, for example, it was recommended to rebrand apprenticeships to make them more attractive for workers over the age of 25. It's also crucial to older people that they live independent lives. Person-centred, strengths-based, preventative approach to ageing is required rather than crisis management, so needs to be a focus on active ageing. Also, older people's voices must be held in equal value to senior staff, planners, developers, etc. Next slide, please. So just to summarise, key to progress in Greater Manchester has been how the 10 different local authorities work together. alongside the Mayor as a combined authority. It's been held by a shared identity, devolution in the role of the Mayor as a figurehead with age friendly as one of his main commitments. Strategically, ageing is one of the combined authority's 10 priorities, and combined with other strategic developments, these have significant implications in terms of policy profile and support. Greater Manchester has also considered age friendly as a cross-cutting and positive initiative that permeates a range of diverse agendas rather than restrict it to a few specific projects. And doing that has helped generate interest in this topic area. Finally, keeping ageing as a positive initiative using language such as age friendly and all age has been welcomed. Next slide, please. So that's almost it from me. There's the case study full report and other documents on the ACPAR website. You can see the link there. And there's also a policy handbook, which is a practical guide which can be used as a starting point for local authorities and policymakers that wish to learn more about successful age-friendly practices. My email address is there to get in touch. We'll have Ange and a Q&A later, but next I'd like to pass on to Nicola.
Thanks, James. And thank you to yourself and to Paul and Gary for asking me to talk a little bit more about our strategic partnership with Greater Manchester and how that plays a part in Greater Manchester's journey on age friendly as a city region. Can I get the next slide? So the Centre for Ageing Better, we are an independent charitable foundation funded by the National Lottery Community Fund in the UK, and we're part of the government's What Works network. So we want everyone to enjoy later life. We are creating change in policy and practice informed by evidence. To do that, we focus on 4 priority goals around employment, housing, health and communities, whilst understanding, as the diagram suggests, that those goals overlap in a holistic understanding of how we age. Can I get the next slide? And also, I think underpinning that is an understanding that we're not aging equally or evenly across the UK, and that the demographics that we're forecasting obviously are being seen in some places sooner than others, and there's many other factors in the inequalities in the experience of ageing. And I would just draw people's attention to the State of Ageing in 2020, which is our annual publication that we published last week, looking at what we know about ageing in the UK. Next slide. So James and Paul asked me to speak a little bit about the why and the how of our local work, and Andrew's going to speak to you about our UK network of age-friendly communities, which is one part of that. The role I hold as a partnership manager is to manage our strategic partnership with Greater Manchester. That's one of 3 strategic partnerships we have. We also have partnerships with Leeds and Lincolnshire. And the third kind of way that we work locally is through the broadcast and dissemination of what we see working across the country. For us, that working locally is important to support more places to adopt exactly those kind of enabling factors that James has just spoken about, to adopt collaborative, place-based strategic approaches to ageing. We are looking to apply evidence and understand how that scales. We're also looking for new evidence of what works, and creating, again, echoing I think what James has said, those places where we can test and innovate. And this extends our reach and impact and our ability to share what works across the UK. Next slide. And this working locally is a central part of our strategy. So this quote here is from our Transforming Later Lives strategy of 2018, and also in reviewing our strategy in light of the events of this year and what we've learned, it's really clear to us that this remains a really central plank of what we do, to see fundamentally how a joined up approach is necessary to realise those opportunities of longer lives. Next slide. So a little bit about what it looks like in Greater Manchester. So we've been in a partnership with Greater Manchester Combined Authority since 2016, and it was our first strategic partnership. And a number of those elements of Greater Manchester as an age-friendly city region that are detailed in the case study. We've been there on that journey with Greater Manchester, so establishing the Ageing Hub, the role of the mayor, and also as the, establishing it as the first UK age-friendly city region. And I think importantly, the work on the local industrial strategy in GM is something to note as well. We particularly had two initial priorities firstly around economic growth and fuller working lives, and also around planning, transport and housing. And we have brought resources as well as our expertise to invest in research, development and strategy work in Greater Manchester. And I've been in role as a partnership manager since 2019 to develop this partnership. Next slide. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, we've worked across the whole range really of the age-friendly strategy in Greater Manchester, but just to talk about those two particular priority areas we focused on and give a practical idea around delivery. In work, we invested a considerable amount of time and resource and expertise with Greater Manchester, understanding worklessness in Greater Manchester and job insecurity for people over 50. And we've published a number of pieces of research around that. That has enabled us to work with the Combined Authority and now with the Department of Work and Pensions on looking at employment support for over 50s and to do that test and learn approach and what could change to make those more effective. And also, I think importantly, bringing co-production with over 50 workers to that piece of work. Alongside that, we're working with Greater Manchester on an age-friendly employer handbook, which builds on our national work around age-friendly employers and age-friendly 5 for employers, and using the opportunity of the GM Good Employment Charter to promote that work. And I think James spoke about apprentices, and we have ongoing research around older apprentices in Greater Manchester and what makes an apprenticeship attractive or an interesting opportunity for older workers. And then if I move on to the next slide. In housing, we have worked alongside Greater Manchester and Manchester School of Architecture on a number of pieces of research. So right sizing looked at the housing offer for older people and how we could reframe that in relation to the motivations and aspirations of older people. We published that piece of research and it's been influential in our own programme around housing. We continue our research partnership with the School of Architecture in a project called Right Place to look in more detail about those motivations and what the opportunities are locally around housing. We've also taken work to understand the role of regeneration in a significantly sized regeneration project in Greater Manchester called the Northern Gateway, as well as we have completed a mobility and transport study, which has enabled Transport for Greater Manchester to develop an age-friendly transport plan. And lastly, an example, very recently, in fact, Greater Manchester have signed up to our Home Coalition. So this is us working with partners to influence nationally standards around building new houses in the UK to make those more suitable for us as we age. So it's a different example of how we work together with a strategic partnership. The next slide. And over the next 3 years, our partnership continues, and we are going to continue focusing on employment and economic recovery and also on housing, both new housing and existing stock. And we're thinking more about how to focus on health inequalities and particularly around physical activity. I think it's important to say that throughout all those 3 areas of focus, we are weaving through those work around inequalities, how we support Greater Manchester and learn from Greater Manchester about how you create system change and leadership, and how we can do more to demonstrate the impact and disseminate that locally, regionally, and nationally, it says there, but also I think, within Europe and internationally as well, so we can develop more places that are age friendly. And if we move on to the next slide. Yeah. So I just wanted to reflect a little bit, and I think a number of these reflect the themes in the work that James has spoken about how we support delivery. And I think that kind of obvious point about evidence of what works, we both bring that and support the Greater Manchester to develop new evidence. But I think the other things that are really important there are about sparking those conversations, building awareness and influence with those leaders in the system, the support and challenge element that we bring, and understanding how you enable change at a city region level to improve the lives of older people in the city region. So I'm going to leave that there, and I think I'm going to pass back to James.
Excellent. So we now have Ange Jones from the Centre for Ageing Better. Ange.
Thank you, James and Paul, for the invitation to speak today. And it's great that my colleague Nicola has been able to give us that overview of Ageing Better. So the Centre for Ageing Better is the affiliate lead to the World Health Organization Global Network of Cities and Communities for the UK. And we have fulfilled that role since 2016, when we came into partnership with the UK network, which was established in 2012, and Paul McGarry was a key part of that establishment. Next slide, please. So I thought I would take you through just the development, really, and the growth of the network that we've seen over certainly the last 3 to 4 years. So in 2017, sorry, if you could just hit enter, there will be some more information. That's brilliant, thank you. We did an initial mapping which showed sort of 18 communities, and as I mentioned, you see Manchester there. We had early city adopters, Belfast, Glasgow, Leeds, Newcastle, Nottingham and Stoke-on-Trent. So there was already a network to grow with. However, it was very much led by project funding, very much supported by MICRA, which was mentioned earlier, and research institutes that were able to host a website, etc. But it was very needed, that project funding, in order to bring people together and have that learning ability. So in 2017 was the time that the Centre for Ageing Better came into partnership with the network and able to bring some resource. In 2018, yes, if you just hit again, that's brilliant. We had 10 further members join, and that was when we had our first city region of Greater Manchester. In 2019, yes, if you hit again, thanks. Another 10 further members joined. We then saw a greater diversification of the network. We had our first town council, Melksham. We had our first English District Council, East Lindsey, and our first County Council, North Yorkshire, join. And this year in 2020, we've had 6 further members so far. We now have 8 out of the 11 Northern Ireland councils a part of the network, and 6 out of the 10 Greater Manchester metropolitan boroughs. As you heard earlier in James' presentation, it's a long-term strategy to have all of the boroughs be age-friendly, and I know that the 4 remaining are in the wings there to join us soon. Next slide, please. So this is the network. We're now at 43 members, and as I said, that greater diversification means that there's, certainly from our perspective, in the sense that it forms itself as a learning network. The role of affiliates is to inspire, connect and support. That's handed down to us, the mantle from the World Health Organization, and obviously the greater the diversification of the membership, the more that we can learn. And even within the city regions and city areas that have been mentioned, there is often a geographical makeup that actually has rural edges, excuse me. So there's always something to learn, by the different membership base. Next slide, please. And so this is just demonstrating really the makeup of the network, and we have around 11 that are primarily rural. And if you hit again, we can now demonstrate that actually the area population that the UK network covers is now 22.49 million people, and 6.87 million of those are aged over 50. So we're looking at about 30% there of the total population. So it has a great, a broad reach and a wide opportunity there to influence how we all experience aging in these places. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch on what is the benefit really, and what we do as a UK network. And really from the growth of the network, we've actually been able to now start to act collectively, and we've really over the last 2 years built up our collective voice and agreed across the network how we want to work together on the issues that in many ways underpin the need for age-friendly communities. So building upon Nicola's earlier mention there of our approach as the Centre for Ageing Better of influencing nationally and delivering locally, last year we as a UK network took our first collective action where we created and an open letter, and local leaders from around the network, of which Andy Burnham was one, signed up to stamp out these outdated attitudes to ageing. Was really a call to reframe the narrative, moving away from vulnerability and a sense of burden towards that asset and strength-based approach from vulnerable to valuable. Yes, and that had far-reaching effects, which was great. Next slide, please. This year, of course, the Decade of Healthy Ageing has begun, and together we considered within the Decade of Healthy Ageing, it has 4 goals. It's a global call to action over the next 10 years. 4 goals. One is to change the approach, attitudes, and narrative on ageing and age. The second, to develop and foster communities that enable healthy and active ageing, so they're age-friendly environments. And 2 other goals around health care and access to medical care. Next slide, please. So as a UK network, we came together again to understand what can we contribute over the next 10 years. So we essentially have galvanised and come together around these long-term goals. And also, it's sort of been talked about in the sense of age-friendly communities. In part, sometimes people can see, obviously, local projects, but what does it really mean? What's behind it, and what is the system change that we want to see? So the UK network will ensure that active and healthy ageing is seen as everybody's business. And that will be by building relationships, learning and collaboration across sectors, services, and between generations. They will ensure that all older people are respected, listened to, and can contribute to decision making in the communities that they live. The UK network will work to encourage the embracing of the diversity of older people, addressing inequalities and ageism, building more equitable places for all of us to age in, and advocate for the physical infrastructure that meets the needs and aspirations of older people, including digital, housing, transport, and public spaces. Next slide, please. And in terms of responding to and planning for recovery from COVID-19, I thought in many ways, as we all know, we can't really talk about this year without thinking about the current context in which we are in. And there were both opportunities and challenges have arisen across the network. The opportunities have been that there has actually been an increased recognition of the ageing and age equality expertise that is seen within network leads and key partners, including older people. So they have been more involved in key response and recovery planning. So there's been recognition of the role that can play in the wider system. And there's been the use of existing area baselines that's part of becoming an age-friendly community and taking yourselves along the journey is, first of all, understanding your place and older people's needs and the realities there. So existing area baselines informed local responses. On the flip side, there were also challenges that age-friendly is not understood, really, not seen as a cohesive response to the system. It's in effect siloed within itself, and I see that very much across the UK network, where and rightly so, because it has its roots in public health, and obviously also understands the wider determinants of health, but at times that placement of age-friendly within health only means that it's not seen or understood and has influence across the whole system. And that's where Greater Manchester, in many ways, is a fantastic example to be able to draw upon across the network, because it has its own ageing hub, and it's very much at the heart of strategy change and making inroads across various aspects, such as transport and housing. And also, generally, the age-friendly work and strategic oversight has taken a backseat in many places, as network leads needed to be redeployed to address more immediate concerns. And obviously, coming up, there's the potential for impending redundancies and cuts to services, and that could affect age-friendly work. Next slide, please. I've really, I struggled actually just to think about how could I capture some of the things across the network, but not necessarily go into a full case study as James has presented, because of course there is so much that could be said. So I've just pulled together a couple of areas just to show the breadth, which those of you who are familiar with age-friendly communities work will be very aware of. But recognising and validating the importance of neighbourhoods, I think, is becoming more and more at the heart of the age-friendly approach, no matter whether it is a city region or a county-wide approach. And COVID-19 has demonstrated that, obviously, to all of us, and the importance of neighbourhoods. And these are just a couple of examples there. Age-friendly leads have a series of neighbourhood networks that the Centre for Ageing Better is currently evaluating, but 37 organisations that have been funded for many years across the council, by the council, but that are in neighbourhoods led primarily by older people. And on the right there, you've got an age-friendly neighbourhood toolkit produced in Bristol, where actually neighbourhoods can sign up. They can say, we are going to be an age-friendly neighbourhood, and then they receive tools, support in order to, and they create neighbourhood action plans. Next slide, please. And then we have social participation and enabling social connections and opportunities from very much, and both of these are different examples, but they are fundamentally underpinned by the same thing, which was getting isolated people. On the left there, you have Melvin, who is recently bereaved, back out and engaging in the community. And he now, he has become a volunteer table host. This is in a small neighbourhood within Leeds, and the table host is for shared tables where older people are supported, who live independently, supported to come out. But the difference being that it's at evenings and weekends, or it certainly was when restaurants were fully functional before. And that's getting out into businesses, having businesses recognise themselves as age friendly. Are they accessible? And having people come together that way. And on the right, as was mentioned earlier by James, the installation of a bench. This was different in the sense that when Melksham had an engagement event, they understood, and older people said that actually this market town centre was well served by benches, but actually what they needed was benches to enable them to walk from their residence into town, because it wasn't actually such a long distance. And so they worked together, older people mapped it out, and you see a quote there by Bob, who is now, has then been encouraged and had the confidence to go out because he knew about those rest places. Next slide, please. And then you've got your big projects as well, your long-term high investment, so improving transport infrastructure and experience. So on the right there, Chester Bus Interchange, which is an award-winning building because of the design, from an accessibility perspective. And on the left there, you have Southern Vectis Bus Company on the Isle of Wight, who undergo age-friendly training, underwent it, and now have that as a part of their continuing professional development for all of their bus drivers, and very supportive of the agenda. And my final slide really just concludes that, of course, there are many more. And I look forward to the growth of the network in the coming months and years, as there are certainly many members waiting in the wings. And this is really just a snapshot of what gets understood as age-friendly, and I think we'll be all aware that there are many, many communities and organisations striving to put ageing and ageing well at the forefront of policies and service provision. We just hope that we can all join together and be visible so that then we can influence the change that we want to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ange. I thought that was really interesting from Nicola and Ange in particular, really. So now we've got time for some questions. We've had a couple in on the chat. Do feel to put anything else into the chat that you'd like us to answer. So I'll take those couple of questions alongside the panellists, which includes Paul McGarry from Greater Manchester. And probably if once we've done that and any more questions, if I just ask for Paul to sum up and his reflections on what's been discussed. And also, I think something interesting is what's happened due to COVID as well, really, that we've, certainly my case study was before COVID, so not really able to touch too much on that. And obviously that's the elephant in the room, so perhaps we'll come back to that towards the end. But the first question we've had in is from Nano, which I'll take and then open up to the panellists. It is, can you elaborate a bit on healthy ageing, James? In particular, what programmes and interventions are aimed at the 50+ age group, or in terms of ages described as deprived, i.e. people who we know they need help to change their behaviour? So I think in terms of my answer to this, it's not an easy one to answer, to be quite honest. And it depends on a number of things, really. So people who need to change their behaviour, or those in areas of deprivation, really, not an easy one to tackle. So often I'd suggest focusing on perhaps other characteristics. In my presentation, I said that older people aren't necessarily a homogenous group. They're not all the same. And you can say that even when you go down to certain demographics, really. So perhaps if you look at that group, but look at just men, for example, what we found really effective in terms of getting men to open up and get involved in these type of initiatives. They like to give things back. So Men in Sheds has been a type of approach that's been effective in terms of engaging men in this agenda and getting out and getting active, really. Also, when you look at minority groups, so rather than focusing on deprivation, if you can focus on something, maybe more of a positive angle that can engage them. So look at them as a community, maybe as a minority community coming together, or, an example before was sort of shared tables, about bringing people together. And even though there might be an element of deprivation behind it. If you can flip the coin, if you like, and look at the positives, that can bring people together rather than just focusing on deprivation, really, and that can create a positive chain of events, really. I don't know if any other panelists want to jump in on that in terms of how we can engage people from deprived areas or who need to change their behaviour.
Paul, I think you should just jump in.
Oh, right, okay.
Not sure if we can see you.
Thanks.
Right.
You know, it's a good question. I think that there's a long answer to this, which is about, you know, meeting people in terms of what they're interested in, thinking about their everyday lives, working with them, not going in with, you know, you've got to join this program to get yourself better. I think the other thing is, you know, the language we need to use in terms of labeling is really important. So you will get the language of deprived neighbourhoods or disadvantaged neighbourhoods and so on. And I think in themselves, some of that labelling process creates barriers to getting people involved in things. You know, somebody turns up and says, well, you know, guys, you live in a deprived neighbourhood, so we're going to do some good stuff for you. I think it is a problem. So you need to think about how you engage with people. And there are countless examples across all of the panel that we can give you there. But I think, you know, it's about sitting down and talking to people, developing trust, working on the things that they want, getting them resources to do things that they're interested in, understanding people's lives the best we can. And most importantly, letting older people lead those programs.
Excellent. And Joe, Nicola, do feel free to jump in if we've missed anything. The next question, again for Paul, really, is about the role of the Mayor of Greater Manchester. So any particular reason why the Mayor is so much committed to the age-friendly city concept? And that's come from Ferhat.
Well, he was asked this question at a conference a couple of weeks ago, actually, and maybe I should just, I'll tell you the two things that he said, and then I'll give you my own kind of insight. So Andy Burnham was the health minister under the Labour government, which is feels like a generation ago now. You know, he was involved and interested in the whole set of issues relating to social care and health and public health. And he took, I think, that knowledge and insight throughout his career. When he became mayor in the run-up to the mayoral election 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, you know, he was lobbied hard by older people's organisations, including some of the people's images that you've seen. And, you know, he was really, he listened, and I think from personal experiences, recognised the need to think about ageing in a different way. And the last thing, which is the thing that he didn't mention, certainly not in these terms, is that I just keep pestering him week in, week out, knocking on his door, trying to make sure that we've got a presence and a visibility of the ageing agenda that's a positive one, that talks right across the agenda. And also is an agenda about the opportunities of ageing populations, the economic opportunities. And telling a long-term story, so not just saying we need to fix health and social care, but the question, fundamental question of how are things going to feel like in 25 years, when actually our mayor's going to be 75, I'm going to be 81. I'm going to want to be living in different types of communities than we do now. So I think that's a combination, and never, you know, never give up as well, keep going.
Great, thanks, Paul. We have had another question in from Valeria, who's said, a question from Venice, although I don't think it's specific to Venice, actually, it's for anyone. What about connection and collaboration between different generations? So, for example, between children and older people, really. I think that's really important, and I think that's something that's relatively untapped. As I said, what came out in part through the research is some of the unexpected examples of interage collaboration, if you like. So I talked about accessibility of new mums and older people, where accessibility is really important. I can certainly reflect that, having a 9-month-old daughter, that accessibility of pavements, benches, and all the rest of it is really important to new families. And there's transport is key in that. There's lots of areas where people of different generations have similar views, or there's sort of crossover, really, and also reflected in the point earlier that we said that older people aren't a homogenous group that can be defined by health outcomes, demographics, deprivation, and all the rest of it, really. I think just finally on that, sometimes intergenerational approaches sometimes treated a bit tokenistically. So there's often the impression that it's got to be, much older people and children, for example. So there's that big age gap, which can be successful, but that isn't the be all and end all of intergenerational approaches. It can be, much closer age groups and groups that perhaps haven't been necessarily connected before. And I definitely think it's an untapped area, and one that deserves much more investigation, research, and test and learn, as I said. Any other panelists like to add on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing, if that's okay, or two things maybe. So the first thing is there's a huge amount of great examples of generational or intergenerational, multi-generational work out there on the net and elsewhere, and some of it feels natural, some of it feels a bit forced sometimes. It's there. I think the immediate question, particularly relating to COVID, is how we bring together generations that feel like they're being pushed apart a little bit at the moment because of COVID, and the kind of ageism that's been a feature of, I think, common public discourse at the moment. So there's loads of stuff out there. I think there's a specific thing about generational relationships now. Last but not least, if you want some advice about how to do that in Venice, I'm more than welcome to. You're more than welcome to invite me over. I know some great places we could go and eat.
James, sorry, can I say something about that?
Yes, you can, as long as I can just add that the person from Venice invites me as well.
I think she will do that. Thank you for the question. I think it's from Valeria. Valeria, thank you very much. Within this project, TACPA, we also have produced, as I said before, a policy handbook with best practices. And I would mention a really interesting initiative put in place by Barcelona, and it's called Viure I Conviure, Living and Sharing. In practice, with this initiative, which is an intergenerational initiative, an older person hosts a student at home during the academic year. And this combats somehow loneliness among older people and offers free housing for young students while promoting solidarity. And Barcelona, I don't know if our colleague Natalia Rossetti is here today, could for sure add something on this and exchange more on this experience. Thank you.
Thank you. We've just got one more question, and then I'd like to sum up and ask Paul just to sum up as well from the Greater Manchester perspective. The question that we've got is from Ferhat, and it's I'd like to direct this to Nicola and Ange if they've got any ideas on this one. So it's, how big an issue is the digital divide? Are there any programs, initiatives to provide digital literacy to older people?
Yeah, so I guess speak from a GM perspective, and then I'm sure Ange has got examples to share on that. But it is a significant issue. I mean, of the nearly 200,000 people in GM that we estimate don't use the internet, 80% of those people are over the age of 65. The Keeping Well This Winter campaign that Paul, I see, has put the link into the chat, recognised this and has just printed 140,000 copies of a paper booklet to be distributed to older people with health advice and other messages to keep well this winter. I think long-term trend is that we've seen a significant shift in use of the internet by older people in the last 10 years, and we've seen a significant shift in take-up over COVID. I think what at the Centre for Ageing Better we're concerned about is the risk that there is a group that will get further left behind as we move to increasingly services being digital by default, telemedicine and these things, and that we have to be having the conversation. And what older people tell us is it's digital skills that are the biggest barrier to them taking part. And I'll pass over to Ange, because I'm sure you've got some examples, Ange, of work from the network to address that.
Yes, thanks, Nicola. Yeah, very much so. There have been, even more so, there's been a focus on not just, in part, it's the actual kit, it's the actual tablets, etc., that are going to be used, but very much the skills that go alongside them. So there's a raft of, whether it's phone support and actually people being coached over the phone to use their piece of equipment. There have been kind of buddy, that the evidence that we have at the Centre for Ageing Better is that what works best is, rather than short-term courses, it's actually about that ongoing support in some way, because and building actually what Paul was saying earlier related to physical activity or behaviour change around health. Again, you have to tap into what somebody actually wants to use it for. Obviously, during this time, it's been very much about video calls, etc. There's going to be a new pilot happening in one place called Barnsley, where they're actually going to provide, at this point, the council 30 older people with the equipment and then a digital coach. But also they've managed to work with a service provider to provide free broadband. It's a 3-month project, and then at the end of that time there's a way to broker either continuing on with that piece of equipment and also getting a low cost provision of the service, because actually cost can be a factor, or the concern about that financial barrier. But very much so, happy to, as I say, I can put a few things in the chat, but it really comes down to equipment, buddying support, and how do you troubleshoot, and then, you know, what's your purpose driving it. Many organisations have been able to take their coffee groups, etc., online, and so people have been willing to adopt. There's been a greater number of people uptaking it, and I think that in part it's about, you know, continuing along that track alongside the production of print to ensure that people don't miss out on information at the same time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ange. I'm aware of time now, so I'd just like to close before passing over to Paul for any final reflections, particularly on the post-COVID or during COVID, if you like, situation. So thanks everyone for attending. Do stay in touch with this agenda, particularly if there's any nice invites to go to any warmer climes, although it's bright blue sky out my window now, which wasn't the case at the start. I must say that the slides and the recording from this session will be available later, and a link will be provided to that via email. So do stay in touch with this agenda. Thanks very much for everyone for attending. I'd just like to pass over to Paul for any final reflections.
Thanks, James, and thanks for taking time to come and meet with us and talk about, you know, what's a critical issue for us all in our work lives and in our private lives and so on. And there was kind of just a couple of points I wanted to make, really. I guess COVID is something we could talk about all day, but I think what I wanted to say is that certainly in Greater Manchester, and I know from across the UK and from speaking to colleagues across the world, you know, this period has been hugely challenging for us. It goes without saying. But what it has done is helped to create partnerships and relationships and amazing pieces of work which are hugely inspiring. And I think if we can take that spirit of creativity and working together into the next phase of the COVID experience, if that's the right term, then I think we can do it. We can achieve an enormous amount. So I think the other thing I'd like to say as well is that a lot of this came from initially from a group that we have organised under the Euro Cities Urban Ageing Working Group. So colleagues should look out for that group as well. And the last thing I just wanted to do is to thank all my colleagues across the ACPA programme, colleagues in Equorus and obviously in Greater Manchester and in the ESPON programme as well. And I think, you know, we have to work hard and we have to work together. And if we do that, I think we can achieve a lot in the new year. So take care, everybody, and have a good Christmas and New Year.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.